Thank you. I'm uh, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited, even though I do not see anyone. Um, I appreciate the opportunity, and it's still exciting, even if you don't see anyone in front of you. You don't see a big audience or a small audience. It's still fun to try to share what you learned. So I appreciate you too for organizing the conference and letting me be part of it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I hope that you see my screen now and you see my presentation. What I want to talk.
It's working well.
Okay, so what I want to talk about today is basically some of my lessons learned from the weekly newsletter and the way that I process information and the way that I'm trying to extract knowledge from the endless amount of content that we have out there in the internet. So it all begins, and this is kind of the, what's in it for you to listen to this talk is basically, what happens if you hear yourself or you have a friend who tells you, I want to become a better, let's say, a better product manager, a better engineering manager, a better data engineer, or a front-end engineer. Now, that being said, now what? Meaning, what can I do next in order to become better as a professional? And my take, in a way, is that we're kind of, in the past like 50 years, due to the kind of the knowledge workers that we have, we live in an area of hypergrowth. I wouldn't say hypergrowth companies, although it does happen that we have companies who's growing extremely crazy, and like Slack, for example, that we're using. But we see that there is this phenomenon of people basically kind of hyper, under the trajectory of learning so quickly or learning so much in such a huge, in such a short period. They're trying to learn as much as they can. And this, I believe, happened when we started to discuss the knowledge workers in the world. Which is kind of funny because, this photo, the thinker is, no one actually sits like this and write code, or doing their work. But I feel that, for many of us, there are millions of people out there, knowledge workers, who actually spend the time thinking as part of their role, meaning they're being paid to learn, to get education, to read. And it's unique, meaning, I don't think that there is any time in the history where you had millions of people being paid to think and to operate on that, and to provide value that requires them to constantly learn and readjust to the ever-changing world. Now, there is a famous phrase you're probably aware of, is that if you show me your friends, I can tell you who you are. And I think this phrase kind of changed during the past few years, since the era of the internet, where if you had to use your friends in order to get the education that you need, because there was so very few people who had the access to books and that knew how to read. Today, I don't think that there is this geo-limitation. Like, this entire conference was organized across basically across the globe. We never saw each other. We never talked more than a few messages over Slack or a few Google Hangouts. And basically, in a way, if you want to have interesting discussions with people, you don't necessarily have to have your friends who lives with you or work with you. If you want to have interesting discussions, you can actually find yourself or put yourself in a place where you have interesting influencers around you that you can have an interesting discussion with them, even if you're not friends with them. And this is kind of an interesting shift, at least the way that I see it in our history. Now, my name is Oren Ellenbogen, and I would appreciate if you reach out via Twitter and say hello, or later on send me your feedback and questions. I'm currently working as the VP Engineering at Fodder. We're a company located in Israel, and we're basically providing a service to catch fraudsters online, basically providing kind of a protection for e-commerce merchants by detecting and preventing fraudulent activity happening on their site. So that's kind of my day job. And during nighttime and weekends, or you can call it hobbies, I have the Software Lead Weekly, which is kind of the newsletter that was mentioned before, and I have a book called Leading Snowflakes, and there is one more thing called Manager README that I've just released. You can check it all out later on, but this talk was basically built on top of the newsletter that I have, and I've been sending it for the past 5.5 years now. So every Friday, I'm sharing 7 posts that I believe worth reading in terms of about culture, about leadership, about management. It can be blog posts, it can be books, it can be lectures, and in those 5.5 years, I've shared more than 2,000 links to interesting content, at least interesting that I saw it as interesting. And to do so, I had to read about almost 15,000 posts, or 15,000 different types of contents to basically curate and pick only 2,000 of them that I felt would provide a lot of value to others. So this process, or this learning of how can you consume a lot of data, and also how can you retain some of the data, meaning how can you extract knowledge from the content, these were kind of the lessons learned that brought me to give this talk today. And I hope that you'll find it interesting as someone who strives to grow and someone who's looking into his personal growth and knows that you want to get better. And I'm sure that the reason that you joined this conference is because you truly care about your own personal growth. You want to create a network, you want to get to know people, you want to have interesting discussions, you want to kind of push your limits in a way. And this is hopefully will provide you some insights into how to get more for your time. So our map for today is basically how to find relevant influencers. Now, when I'm saying how to find growth materials, my assumption is that even though you don't need to have necessarily friends in order to learn from them, you can just learn from influencers. I still believe that as humans, we are social kind of social animals where we need to we work best, or we learn best when we have people around us that we can discuss things around, and we learn best by following people in terms of at least following by using our curiosity and letting them guide us in terms of interesting things that they have to say, or interesting things that they have to share. So I would like to first tackle the how do you find the relevant influencers for you? So if you want to become a better, let's say, better front-end engineer, how can you find the relevant influencers to teach you that? The second thing would be, how can you consume content faster? Now, this is always kind of an interesting topic because, faster doesn't mean more effective, right? So you don't want to consume content faster without the ability to retain that content or to retain that knowledge. But like typing on your keyboard, there is a huge benefit of typing faster, meaning if you're able to write as quickly as you think, there is an advantage in doing that, meaning you would like to reduce the white noise, or just the time gap between what you think and what you write. And the same applies to content. That means that if you have methods or ways to be able to consume data faster without compromising your comprehension of that content, you should strive to do so, just because our time is limited and we cannot buy more time. Third part would be, how can you extract the knowledge from that content and how you can retain that? And those are tactics that I would love to share from my experience, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. Okay, so let's start with the first topic around finding influencers. Now, I see influencers kind of as my lead generation for content, meaning by now that I will follow the right people, I'm increasing the probability of them sharing content that would help with my personal growth. So when I'm trying to look for influencers to follow, I'm trying to ask myself, who do I know that's already kicking ass? Who do I know that's already kind of brilliant or kind of, at least a year or 2 years more advanced than me in that topic, and I think that I can learn a lot from them. Now, naturally, we do it if we work with people in our companies. We have this tendency to be around people that we believe that can teach us a few things that we want to learn. So as humans, you don't have to, to develop any new skill. You basically just need to figure out a way in this ever-connected, around the globe society. How can you find that person that is not sitting with you in the room or not having, the same company, even if you're working remote? How can you find that person to follow? So you can be around them, and you can kind of get the ideas from them, and even have a discussion with them. Now, one trick that I found to be very helpful to find influencers is to find to look for companies and not for influencers. What do I mean by that? So let's say that I want to be to improve as a data engineer at Fodder. Okay, so I come to work. I'm working as a data engineer at Fodder, and I want to understand how can I improve. Now, assume that someone asks this question. Maybe someone else on the team will tell him, listen, I've heard a few great talks in this conference from some guys from Airbnb. I don't even remember the name, but I do remember that Airbnb they're doing some great things around data engineering and around machine learning. And this is kind of the seed. The seed means, okay, you know that you want to become a better data engineer, and you heard that there is a company called Airbnb that they're dealing with interesting data engineering problems. Now, we will talk in a second. What do you do if you don't know which companies are doing great in this area? So give me a few minutes and we'll get to it. But let's say that you know that Airbnb are doing great things. Now your job would be, okay, so assuming that Airbnb are great, who is working there that I can follow, and I can learn from them about which things I can take from them to apply here at where I work. So Twitter is kind of an interesting way or interesting platform, because it's kind of the only platform where humans can follow other humans, and it's totally fine. Nobody's surprised. Nobody's feeling embarrassed or strange. That's actually expected, which is great. So if I go to Twitter, and I took a few screenshots because I wasn't sure what would be the most effective way. I didn't want to switch to actually doing it live, although it could be fun. But basically, I went to Twitter and I wrote Airbnb and hit the search button. What you see here is basically the results of that search. And I remind you that we want to find influencers, meaning data engineers who work at Airbnb. And we want to follow them because hopefully they will be able to teach us interesting things on how to become a better data engineer. Okay, so I click that. I scroll down. I saw that under the Airbnb engineering, they mentioned Airbnb data, which is great. Click on that, and I reach here. That looks like the page of the Airbnb data team that they have, the Twitter user. And what I usually do, I click on the following, meaning I click on the Airbnb data team to see who they are following. Usually, most companies, they will follow the team. The team Twitter profile will follow the individual working on that team. So I clicked on that, and this has actually been done like a real example that I've actually practiced here at Fodder, where people came to me and asked me this question. So I actually did this live search with them, and I just took a few snapshots just for you to see. But okay, so I clicked on who they're following, and I see that they're following Arthur. And you can see in the description there that is a data engineering at Airbnb. You can see like Airflow, which is a related framework for data engineering. And I'm saying, okay, interesting. Let's see if Arthur is an interesting influencer. Click on Arthur. And now the question would be, should I follow Arthur, right? Who should I follow, basically? So kind of my rule of thumb to define whether or not it's worthwhile for you to follow someone is to ask myself, can I, to check how useful is that person for my learning? How useful is that person to help me with my own personal growth? I remind you, I want to become a better data engineer. So what I do, I usually apply this small algorithm, which is to make sure that their account is still active, meaning they tweeted in the past few months. And I want to see that in the last 10 tweets, I was able to get at least one inspirational content. Inspirational content meaning that it made me think. I'm not sure it was necessarily pragmatic, but at least it made me think, and it made me kind of pause for a few seconds and think about, what exactly am I reading here, and what do I want to do with it. And second would be, did I get at least one educational content or reference? It may be a blog post reference, it may be a talk, a video lecture, it may be a book, it may be anything else. And if I get at least one of each, then I believe it would be interesting to follow that person, because the signal versus noise ratio is good enough, at least for me. So looking back at Arthur, I can see that by scrolling a bit down, I see that he shared how Airbnb is playing with experimentation, meaning how they use data and conduct experimentation to improve the product, which goes to the educational content. So great, Arthur is actually sharing interesting posts out there about data engineering that I can learn from. And second would be inspirational content. In this case, he talks about the trade-offs between whether or not you want to wait for the full time of the data crunching process to finish, or do you want something quick that you can follow up with instead of waiting for it? Again, kind of me stopping here and saying, okay, what do I want? Like, what am I missing here, or which interesting parts do I see here? So for one example, looking at the latency versus completeness trade-offs, even that statement by itself is, oh, that's actually very interesting, because when you're talking about data engineering, obviously the amount of data truly change your ability to get knowledge or to get insights from it, because if you have enough of it, then running complex queries on top of it can take a lot of time. So again, interesting perspective from Arthur. And for me, the decision is pretty simple. Yes, I would definitely follow Arthur if I would like to improve my data engineering skills. Now, how to continue? You basically need to repeat that process, and you need to go and find yourself, I would say at least 20 or 30 influencers, applying the same principles that I've just showed. You can use a couple of tips that I've been using. You can see in this example, Arthur, you can look back and see who Arthur is following. And one thing that I enjoy doing is every 12 months, I enjoy kind of looking back on the people that I'm following, and I'm trying to ask myself, okay, maybe let's start from scratch, because as we grow and as we improve as professionals, we sometimes seek for different influencers. We maybe want to seek for new content or to grow in different areas. And now the influencers that we follow, we want to basically find a different circle to be part of, and listen while that circle is talking and be part of this conversation. Now, one more trick that I would do to find the influencers on Twitter is actually using LinkedIn, which I know is kind of crazy, but it works. So what I do is, in this example, I basically I search for people from Airbnb, and in the title, data engineer, I saw that David is actually data infrastructure engineer at Airbnb, which is great. I go to David's profile, and voila, there is his Twitter profile there. So again, going back to Twitter, checking to see the signal versus noise ratio for David. And if I like what I see and I learn from it, then I would follow David. So that's the process there. And LinkedIn can help you with finding those influencers sometimes in a very effective manner. Now, how do I know which relevant companies to use kind of as a seed to find the people, the influencers that I want to follow? So one thing that I'm doing most of the time is basically asking this question via on Quora, or using Google's site label. So basically I can say, best companies for data engineer, or best companies for product managers, or whatever you would like to improve and work on. And in this aspect, so you can see that you get to Quora, and you can see that Airbnb is part of the list, but you can see also companies like Palantir and Square and others that might be interesting for you to follow. And I really like the first paragraph where you can see that if the company recruited the Inside Data Science Fellows, it probably means that this company is an interesting company or have at least interesting people. Again, I never thought about that, but reading that, it makes a lot of sense. So you can use that kind of create that initial seed of companies and use that to find the influencers. One more thing you can try, and this again goes to weekly. There are many weeklies out there around technology and also about culture and leadership and other areas. And basically, by joining and subscribing to that weekly, you're in a way following the curator, or you're following the insights that the curator is pointing you into it. So that's kind of an easy way that you can follow just one newsletter and subscribe to it and get familiar with others, with other interesting people, with other interesting content. If you want to find an interesting list of weeklies, you can basically go to GitHub. You have this link at the top, and there is an interesting curation here of a lot of interesting newsletters that you can subscribe to. I definitely recommend you to try it out and see if it works for you, and you can see if the noise versus the signal versus noise ratio of the curator is good enough for you. Okay. So far, we basically talked about how to create, how to find interesting influencers. And the assumption is that by following interesting influencers, you will also be exposed to relevant content. So the question now becomes, okay, assuming that I have this content, how can I consume it faster? So my tips for you is, first and foremost, have fun. Meaning, if you find yourself reading and you hate it and it's boring, you're not having fun, then you'll find yourself in a few minutes starting to read Facebook or browsing around the internet in Hacker News or Reddit or whatnot, instead of reading what you're supposed to read. So nobody will congratulate you on reading every paragraph or every line in a book. Nobody will tell you, you did a great job by reading every single word in a blog post that is completely boring for you. So if I find myself not enjoying the content that I consume, I immediately stop. And the reason is that I would like to get accustomed, or I like to get my mind feel that reading and consuming content is actually a pleasant experience, unlike, at least for me, running, where I know that I need to run, but every time that I'm running, my brain's kind of sending the signals of why are you doing that? And I need to listen to podcasts or do other things while I run, just to kind of find myself in a, I wouldn't say pleasant mode, but at least in a bearable mode. So I would definitely aim for a sustainable personal growth, meaning that hyper-growth humans are focusing on the long term. I see it as a way that you understand that learning is a never-ending process, and you want to enjoy every part of it. Otherwise, you will find yourself avoiding books or avoiding new content, and kind of feeling the need to give yourself those small dopamine doses reading Facebook or doing those things that are not really great for your mind. So when I read content, assuming that I'm happy and I like the content, what I do before I start reading it can be a book, it can be a chapter in a book, it can be a blog post. What I would do, I would skim. I would basically read the headlines, and then I would read the first sentence of every paragraph. This helps me by doing two things. Now, when you read technical content, so for example, imagine your last blog post that you read, that it's technical, right? It's not like a science fiction book. It's something that would help you to improve the way that you're doing prioritization as a product manager, let's say. So when reading, there are a lot of white noise. By white noise, I mean that there are many paragraphs about the company or a paragraph about the author, things that are not really relevant to your learning. meaning you don't really care about whether or not this person works at company A or company B. You're reading his blog post because you want to know about what they have to say about it, and not about their necessarily about their background. So by reading the headlines and reading the first sentence of every paragraph, I can kind of mark in my head which parts or which paragraphs I want to ignore. And on the other side, if there are paragraphs where I read the first sentence and I almost cannot stop myself to continue and read because it sounds really interesting, I know that these areas are areas that I would like to focus on and slow down, meaning I would maybe want to read slower, and I would like to take the time to think about it. So before you start reading, quickly skim the content and try to mark in your head which parts you want to completely ignore and which parts you want to double down on and slow down and invest more time in. Now, if you want to read faster or to listen on, let's say, double speed on a podcast that you like, one thing that you have to note is that your fluency in the language, like English is not my native language, but I'm able to read really quickly and to listen to podcasts on double speed because I'm reading a lot. I'm reading a lot. That means that when I'm reading text, my mind does not stop in words. Like there are very few words that I don't know, at least around the technical areas that I read about. So it's not only to read English, so I need to know all the words in the English dictionary. It's also technical words. So if you're a data engineer, you might need to be aware of words like, let's say, event sourcing, or let's say Airflow, or other technologies or other concepts. So when you're reading, you'll be able to become fluent and read without your mind saying, hey, I don't understand this word. Now I need to somehow compensate on that and read the entire sentence just to figure out what this word means. So one approach that I've used, at least at the beginning, was to use the flashcards. There are some apps for it if you want, or you can use actually like pen and paper, and use the spaced repetition. You can look it up later on, but basically in a way to practice your memory and making sure that the words live in your mind somewhere and your brain is able to pick it up when needed. So this is really helpful for me, and I learned a lot when I was younger just by practicing spaced repetition on words that I knew that I'm going to be facing a lot in this field. Now, the second part would be you have to practice, and by practicing, it's either by reading a lot of content or listening to a lot of lectures or interviews in podcasts, and you truly have to invest in it. And I really wanted to kind of give you this feeling of, when I'm saying read a lot, what goes through my mind is actually these pictures. You would have to imagine every time that you're reading that you have to read more and you have to read more because you have to get used to the fact that to read fluently and to be able to enjoy reading, you have to practice it in a way. Now, when it comes to playing double speed, so let's say that I'm listening to podcasts. Again, if you listen to a podcast that is somehow technical or somehow around your personal growth area, then there is a lot of benefit to be able to listen twice as fast. And we'll discuss in a second how to actually retain that information. But there is a lot of benefit to be able to consume that data faster. So what I'm doing usually is when people ask me for advice on how can they improve the speed, is that I remind them that they need to become fluent, meaning that if they listen to someone, and there is a big difference between listening to someone and being able to talk. So if you listen to someone, you have to become fluent in terms of if they're talking, you have to understand every word that they're saying. Now, I usually start at, let's say, 1.4, the speed, so like 40% more. And for most people, if they're used to like regular speed, and now they're listening on 1.4 for 2 minutes, it's very hard for them. It was very hard for me. So I'm sure it's kind of something that you have to kind of focus when you do that, because your brain is kind of yelling at you, listen, you can move slower. Why are you doing that? And we have to somehow say, okay, I'm going to focus now. For this for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to start and I'm going to listen with 1.4. And after 2 minutes, what I usually do, I do get it a bit lower to 1.2. Now, what you would find is that if you practice that, is that if at the beginning on 1.4 you had it, you understood, let's say 70% of of the words or the sentences, when you go back to 1.2, you'll suddenly realize that it's not that bad. Meaning, if you tell 70%, now you're able to understand 90%. And that is very strong, because by doing that, you kind of proved yourself that you can at least listen 20%. You can save at least 20% of your time just by playing this mind trick and kind of hacking your brain to do that. Now, what I found is that if you play this trick and you slowly move from, instead of 1.4 to 1.6, and then slowing down to 1.4, and then playing this game with your mind, you can actually kind of bring yourself to a way, even if it will take a few weeks, you can bring yourself to be able to listen at least double speed, and you'll be able to understand 90%, 95% of the content that is there, which is great. Again, because I remind you, audio, unlike content, it's very hard to skim. You can use the transcript, but it's very hard to skim by listening to, let's say, to a podcast that you listen to while you're driving to work. So this is what I usually recommend. I did it multiple times, and it worked extremely nicely for me. I'm still trying to get myself to listen a bit faster, but kind of double the speed for now. That's as far as I get for most podcasts. Okay, so you got the content, and you have a few tricks now to be able to get that content out or consume it faster. Now the question becomes, okay, so how do I actually gain knowledge from it or retain anything from what I just listened to or read? One thing, again, this picture, is there is this concept of power posing. So if you look it up later on, you'll see that if you stand in a certain way, there are some interesting experimentation that kind of prove that you're getting all the right signals in your brain to give you some confidence boost in a way that you're ready for it. You're ready for an adventure, or you're ready for to get up on stage and talk in front of a big audience. I'm using kind of the same principle in terms of mental power posing, meaning that before I'm trying to get my mind into a learning phase, I'm trying to imagine this kind of thinking man. I'm saying, okay, I'm not going to have 20 minutes, and I know that I want to have a meaningful 20 minutes learning session. I picture this in my mind, and I'm trying to say, okay, calm down. You're about to go into a learning session now. Let's make it fun. Let's make it useful. This is kind of a mental power posing. So, find your own image or your own mental posing, if you will, and bring down your brain, or slow down your brain, so your brain will be able to start being more aware of of the content it's about to consume. So let's talk about growth materials, because the presentation was talking about how to find growth materials. So what is growth materials? The way that I see it, I try to break it into 3 parts. One would be growth material that helps you to gain new perspective, meaning something that you didn't think about before in that way, and now you actually have an interesting approach or interesting way to look at that thing. The second would be something that it's pragmatic, something that's like a tactic, something that's very simple that you can take and use today. So if you're an engineer, software engineer, then you can basically do it thousands of times per day. Just by opening Stack Overflow and searching up for some exceptions that you had, you basically are learning one pragmatic tactic by following the answer on Stack Overflow. Lastly would be content that helps you frame existing views that you have, but puts it in a much more concise way. Meaning, imagine that you listen to someone and you completely agree with them, and they didn't teach you anything new, But what they did, they were able to convey a message that you have in a single sentence, where for you, it would take, I don't know, like 2 minutes to get to the same point. So that's what I mean by framing an existing view. So I kind of look at growth materials falling into one of those buckets. And we'll see in a second why it's important. So new perspective, just for an example, you read about testing, and you're starting to understand that testing is actually important because it's actually influenced the way that your code looks like. And you're starting to realize that you're going to use that code and to maintain it and to basically potentially refactor it in the next, I don't know, 3 or 4 years that you're going to be in that company. So even if it adds 10% to the time it will take you to develop it today, there is this new perspective on testing that if I look in the long term on my next 4 years in this company, is that a right investment? And then tests become not only something you do, but it actually changed the way that you write code, because you're starting to think about testing as an architecture advantage, and you think about testing as a maintenance or refactoring advantage that is important for you. So when I saw testing at the beginning, my mind was kind of racing between what do I think about this whole thing? What do I think about TDD? Like, what do I think about whether or not people should do manual testing? And this is what I mean by new perspective. Now, pragmatic tactic would be, as I've mentioned, just picking up an interesting tool or interesting way to do something, and you can use it immediately. So when for the first time I learned that you can basically kind of abstract away how you get the current time of the machine, that helps you when writing tests, because now you can inject that and you can have a predictable way to run a test without considering the actual system times, which is not really interesting in most cases. Lastly, there is the framing concept. Now, framing, at least for software engineers, is very easy because most of us learn design patterns somewhere, may it be in the university or may it be by reading a book or a blog post. But design patterns are exactly framing. It's kind of, they give you a problem and a solution, and they put it in a sentence so you can actually use that later on to explain something maybe very complex in a single sentence. So broken windows theory can come to mind, at least on my side, or even things like again, like the design patterns that are so obvious and so common in the software engineering world. Now, when I want to learn, I'm trying to prime my mind for learning, meaning I'm trying to ask myself which kind of growth type I'm going to consume now. And I'm asking myself, what am I looking to learn by consuming that content? Now, by doing so, there is a bigger probability of your mind to be able to comprehend and learn, just because you prepare the mind to be ready to meet new things. So there is a great book of Thinking Slow and Fast, which talks about System 1 and System 2. Basically, System 1 is the part of your brain that reacts immediately, kind of if there is something that is surprising. System 1 will kick in and will basically tell you, what should I do now? Should I basically run away, or should I stand here and fight? And we've seen time after time, mostly in terms of learning, that if you surprise someone, you might potentially block them. Meaning, imagine that you're going to a room of students and you tell them something that is so shocking to them that it might be even with complete contradiction to their own sets of beliefs. Now, what happens is that in that second, you kind of lose them. Why? Because while you continue to talk, they're thinking on how to contradict your statement. Okay, so in the software world, you might say, I don't know, like Scrum is not a great methodology. And now some portion of your audience, instead of listening, they will say, what? No, Scrum is amazing. And this surprise where you said Scrum is not a great methodology, that surprise might have contradicted their beliefs and put them in a defensive mode. So I'm asking myself questions before I'm starting to read. And I'm trying to frame those questions around what is the expected growth type, meaning which one of the three things I'm going to learn and which questions I would like to prime myself with. So let me give you an example to make it concrete. Now, Airbnb released just yesterday an interesting post saying that they decided to move away from React Native. Okay. Now, if I look at the growth types, this is probably a new perspective or framing. I do not expect to read about their decision to sunset and to avoid using React Native to learn a few tactics, because they're probably going to explain, what are the reasons behind them leaving that technology, which is getting a lot of hype, at least in the last couple of years. So the growth types would be a new perspective or framing. Now, the questions that I have in mind would be, before reading this blog post, would be, why would I leave React Native? Or what do I know about React Native that I could think of? I would imagine maybe they're leaving React Native because they reach a certain scale. May it be a certain scale of engineers who work on the same code. May it be a scale of lines of code or the performance of a big application. So I'm trying to think of ways that what would make me leave React Native? And what can I imagine that drove them to decide that? And I'm doing that before I'm reading the content, just in a way to kind of remove any potential surprise that my mind is going to be facing, and to really allow myself to read without kind of trying to analyze what I'm reading as I go, but let my mind read and consume the content. And then after I'm done, I want to be able to ask myself questions afterwards. Meaning, after I'm done reading the post, I would like to ask myself, did this content or did these decisions that they did with Airbnb, did it remind me of something else? Like, are there some metaphors or there's some other things that this post remind me of that I would like to use? Did it in any way change the way that I think about the problem? What did I learn from that I didn't know before? So by asking myself those questions afterwards, I have to truly understand what exactly did I read here. And then you can do the working of trying to put it in your own words. So every time I'm reading something that I believe is imperative for my personal growth, I'm trying to explain it in my own words. My own words, they are important because the way that I would explain what I've just learned is that I would try to use images, or I would like to use examples that are very simple or very obvious for me, and I'm not sure it will be the case for everyone else. So I'm trying to explain it to myself. And then I'm trying to explain it to the team, to my team. So where I'm working today, when someone is reading and learning something new and they're sharing that, we expect them to tell what they took from it, and also use the words that the team will feel comfortable with. Because again, we have a very specific language here at Forter in terms of, every company has their own kind of lingo that we invent. So you want to be able to say, hey, Airbnb decided to leave React Native, and it's applicable for us. And I'm usually enjoy using the if-then, where I saw that, I learned from it. What I think it will be applicable to us at Forter if that situation would happen, and then if so, then we can do X, Y, and Z to gain that knowledge that Airbnb brought up. So it's crucial that after you read and you ask yourself, what did you take from it? What did it change about your set of beliefs, or which kind of new tool that you learned from it or tactic? Try to make it applicable. Try to say, I believe that we can use it for this service. I believe that we can use it when this thing will happen in our company. So the one takeaway that I would like you to take from this whole talk is basically surround yourself with the influencers that you'd like your future self to be the average of. So imagine, who are these circles, who are these people that you'd like to be part of the conversation with, and that you'll feel honored, and you'll enjoy just be around them and get to learn from them. So the way that I see it is the hyper-growth human there are people who deliberately and effectively seek wisdom. That means that I believe that we are all, in a way, as knowledge workers, we try to find things that will help us improve, that will help us scale ourselves in a way. And we're trying to do it effectively because we know that our time is limited. And we know that we want to do other things other than reading or listening to podcasts. We have other things in life. So we constantly ask ourselves, how can we do it more effectively? So this is kind of my definition for hypergrowth human. And I'm doing my best every day to hold myself accountable to deliberately and effectively seek for wisdom by trying to follow the right influencers. And it's perfectly fine to change them over time, but I'm trying to hold myself accountable for learning and for growing as a person. So with that, I would love to say thank you just for listening. And if you have some interesting feedback or any comment, if you have any question, feel free to send me an email to my personal Gmail or to tweet it at me. And I would love to say hello and help out. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Oren. So I will start by asking one single question, and it's if you have any advice on once you acquire the knowledge, how to share it with other people.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It really depends on the person. Sometimes people are more introverts. Like even for me, even now I was super excited to talk about this thing because I'm not used to speak in front of others in big, well, at least, outside of people that I know and trust. So I think that you can share it by just sharing it with your team and maybe add a few comments. So if you're using Slack, you can say, hey, I really recommend reading this blog post. Now, here are my takeaways from it, and here is how it's applicable to our company. And you can start there. If you feel really adventurous, you can try to use, to write blog posts or to even give a talk about those topics. And I think you have to somehow push your limits in a way and try to do things that are kind of scary but fun and exciting for you. But I would definitely start with just send an email or send a Slack message with, you should read this. These are my takeaways, and here is how it's applicable for us.
Okay, Oren, second question from Mono. It's super interesting, your way of acquiring knowledge. And I was kind of trying to do the same. And I was having this doubt lately about how to manage conflicting views. Like, for example, you follow a certain person and then another person has perhaps not the opposite, but a very conflicting point of view, and you still are not sure whether one of them is right or not. So my question is, how do you manage these things on the long run? Do you listen to different worldviews or like different views about things and then try to coordinate in your head, or do you maintain the discrepancies in your head, or do you just focus on one school of thought versus the other over time? How do you handle those things?
Yeah, it's very good point. So what I usually do, and the beautiful thing about Twitter, and also about people being open to receive an email from a stranger that wants to ask them a question about what they wrote, is that I'm trying to ask about the trade-offs that person. So if a person they have a very specific way of describe a problem or a solution, I'm trying to ask them what brought them to that conclusion, or what brought them to this state of mind. So if I see two contradict views, I will try to reach out to those two people, and I'll try to tell them, take a step back. Can you explain more about the context or the problems or the trade-offs that you were facing that led you to this conclusion? Because even with this post of Airbnb, I see like companies that, I see people that read it and say, oh, if Airbnb are living React Native, then my own startup that we are 4 people we should live React Native as well. And I'm saying, yes, but Airbnb have probably like thousands of engineers. You are a 4-people startup doing an iOS and Android and a web application. Why are you even trying to compare yourself to Airbnb? So when having contradiction, try to go back to those people and ask them some questions around that, around the context, the trade-offs, and where this point of view is coming from. And then, feel free to make the decision that's based on your needs, because nobody really know what exactly you're up to. Nobody knows exactly enough context about your company, your team, the people that you work with, your challenges. So don't assume that the influencers will share things that are 100% related to you. They will share things that are 100% related to them, and it's up to you to understand the trade-offs.
That's a brilliant answer. I would have never have thought of actually reaching out to the influencers. So it's very true. Like it's very dynamic process, and you can actually ask questions. That's super cool. So I'm checking now YouTube. So we are going to move to our second speaker in India. I think he's online right now, Ranganathan, and he's going to be talking today about software estimation.
Yeah. Hi everyone.
So, hello. Yes, I think we can all hear you. Hello there. And as I see from your description, you're a teamsmith. You trim noise from teams, and you're a head of engineering. So we really look forward to hearing your talk.
So hi everyone. So I'll just try to introduce myself. I'm a dozen years of experience in doing product development. I'm passionate about building and debugging teams. At present, I do two roles. One is like the operator, and also I lead a few engineering teams. So this talk is actually based on an article that I wrote a few months back.